Hey guys, I'm the 50s Kid. This video is geared towards the brand new E46 owner or a future E46 owner. If you don't really know much about the E46 chassis, in this video I'm going to teach you all about all the jobs you need to do and parts you need to replace when you buy an E46 to guarantee that it will be a reliable and dependable car for years to come. So let's get started. So first let's talk about oil. Whether you have to change it right away, if you pull out the dipstick and get a little bit of it on your glove and it looks really dark and black, you definitely need to change it right away. If not, you still have a little ways to go, but you're going to need to change your oil eventually. So what should you use? You should use full synthetic oil, not synthetic blend, not conventional. The reason for that is because the recommended service interval on a BMW car is actually 15,000 miles, which is a really long time. And I do not recommend you actually go that long between changing your oil. You want to change it twice as often. So you want to change it every 7,500 miles. The reason for this is because even synthetic oils will begin to break down at around 10,000 miles. Only the BMW approved long life oils can actually make it to 15,000. And even then, I think that's pushing it. I've taken apart a lot of E46s in the junkyards. I've taken a lot of valve covers off. And some cars have dark red baked on varnish on the valve train components, and some of them have really nice light golden oil deposits on them. If you want if you want to treat your engine right, you have to change your oil way more often than 15,000 miles. So change it every 7,500 miles. Use full synthetic. You want to use 5W30 oil. That's a good generic oil that I can recommend to everybody. If you're in a really hot climate, like let's say Dubai or something, you want to go with a 5W40 or a 5W50 if they make that over there. If you're in a freezing climate, you want to look for a 0W40. It really doesn't matter which brand you choose as long as it's full synthetic. If you want to know which particular brand I use this one. It's Kendall GT1 Max. You can get this on Amazon. I'll throw some links in the description. I kind of like this one because when I first started using it, it really quieted down my noisy valve train. You know, lifter tick is kind of a common problem on these particular engines. So that's what I found when I used it, and somebody else on Instagram told me they had the exact same results. It's not guaranteed. I don't know if you're going to have those results if you use this, but this is what I've been using. Now when it comes to transmission fluid, you definitely want to change it. BMW says that the transmission fluid is lifetime fill, but that is not true, and you should not follow that. You want to change your transmission fluid at least every 50,000 miles along with the filter. Now, most of you are going to have an automatic transmission with an E46, and there are basically two different automatic transmissions. There's one made by GM and one made by ZF. When it comes to the GM one, you can just basically use any Dexron 3 compatible transmission fluid with that. When it comes to the ZF transmission, you want to use, this is what I use. I use Castrol Transmax Import Multi-Vehicle because it meets the BMW LT71141 specification. That's what you want to look for on the back of the bottle of whatever transmission fluid you decide to go with. Now, how do you tell if you have a GM or a ZF transmission? Well, this is what the ZF transmission pan looks like. Jack the car up, get underneath, and take a look. If your transmission pan looks like this, with this green label over here, that's the ZF. Otherwise, you've got a GM. Now, if you have a manual transmission, you'll want to use MTF2 fluid. And this is the OEM brand, Pentacin right here. This is actually discontinued now, but there is an alternative MTF2 fluid that you can buy on Amazon. I will throw a link to it down in the description. The last fluid you'll want to change is the differential oil. I have a video on that. It's really easy. The fluid you want to use is any synthetic 75W90 gear oil. The very first thing you will want to change on your E46 is the expansion tank. It sits right there. The reason you want to change it is because they will crack. This will happen on every single E46. It is a pattern failure. Every one of these expansion tanks will crack right around maybe the 90,000 mile mark. You definitely want to change it by then. I would change these every 75,000 miles. When this cracks, you will immediately overheat your engine. And when you do that, the cylinder head will lift. It'll pull out the head bolts. The head bolts will pull out the threads from the block, and your head gasket will blow. You could potentially get cracks in your cylinder head. That happened to me. where coolant will then leak out into the exhaust ports. It's just a bad day, and you don't want that to happen to you, and you especially don't want an E46 that has happened to. So you want to hopefully this didn't happen to your E46 already. And if you are, maybe let's say you're the original owner, if you bought a really low mileage E46, change this right away, especially if you don't know whether it's been changed yet or not, because you want to avoid having this problem. When you go ahead and change this, you'll also want to change the upper coolant hose and the lower coolant hose as well. It's not that there's anything particularly wrong with the coolant hoses. You know, they don't fail. They're not a pattern failure, let's say, but it's going to be really difficult to get them off of where they snap onto, and they actually have little O-rings inside of them that help seal. Those O-rings are going to be really crusted on. It'll be difficult to get them off, and the thing is, if you go to reuse them with those old O-rings, they might not seal as perfectly as they were before. So I definitely don't recommend reusing them, especially if they're extremely high mileage. So you just want to go ahead and plan for replacing your upper radiator hose and your lower radiator hose. There's also a little coolant temperature sensor sitting in the lower radiator hose, and you're going to need to change the O-ring on that. You don't have to change the sensor, but you have to change the O-ring when you switch it over to the new coolant hose, because the coolant hose does not come with that sensor pre-installed. So I will give you the part number for the O-ring in the description of this video. The next parts you want to change while you're working on the cooling system and you're changing the upper and lower radiator hose are you want to change the thermostat housing and you want to change the water pump right here. The thermostat housing will crack. It's plastic. Eventually they do crack and leak, so you want to change that before it happens. With the water pump, they were actually made with plastic impellers, and eventually those plastic impellers will shatter and kind of send pieces all throughout your cooling system, so you just want to replace it before that happens. When it comes to BMW coolant, you want to either go with the actual BMW brand blue coolant, or this particular Euro formulated blue coolant that's for BMWs. They're both blue coolants. You want to go with one of those. The last cooling system related part you might want to change is the radiator. It's not a pattern failure. They last just as long as any other car radiator, but if you're thinking about preventative maintenance, you might want to replace it at around the 150,000 mile mark, just to make sure you don't have a catastrophic failure. While you're in here changing the water pump, take a look at the condition of your belt, and if it's all cracked in between the ribs or if it's dry rotted, you definitely want to change it. You'll also want to change the air conditioning belt as well. Belts should typically be changed every 100,000 miles. Another fluid it might be good to replace would be your ATF fluid. You want to take a look. If it's all murky, then you definitely want to change it. New ATF fluid should look red and clear like this. And to change that, it's not too difficult. The power steering pump is down here. This is the power steering pump right here. If you jack the car up and take off the lower splash shield, you'll be able to see where the main hose feeds into the power steering pump. All you have to do is disconnect the hose, and that'll drain out all of the fluid. And then you just go ahead and put the hose back on and replace the clamp with just a typical worm clamp. I have a video on how to change the power steering pump where you will see the procedure in there. Of course, you want to remove your air filter and your cabin air filter. Take a look at them. If they're really dirty, go ahead and replace them. So obviously I've begun to remove different components. I'm doing this so that you can get a better idea of what everything looks like as we go forward. If you want to know how to do this, check out my common repair steps video. So one part you want to take a look at is your DISA valve. This is actually what it looks like, and all it does is it changes the length of the intake runners to kind of give you more power. And if it goes bad like this one has, it'll just kind of flap all in the breeze like this, and this little pin on the end actually tends to come out. And you want to be real careful when removing this, because if this pin falls out and falls down in the intake, that's really bad. So when you're removing this, kind of tilt it up like that and pull it out real slowly, gingerly. You can buy a rebuild kit for these. Many places, you can just buy a generic one from eBay, or you can buy one from German Auto Solutions. I'll throw links down in the description. You'll notice that this O-ring right here, it's actually kind of a molded in one, and it's actually really flattened. When it was brand new, it was much thicker, but it just flattens out over time. You're going to want to scrape this old O-ring out of this channel and replace it with an O-ring from your rebuild kit. If you don't do that, if your O-ring's in this shape, it's going to cause vacuum leaks, and that's going to be a problem. Another really common source for vacuum leaks is going to be from the lower intake boot right here. It's actually going to be from this little section right here, right in between, right in here. It likes to tear out from fatigue because it's, you know, just bent in that way for all this time. So if that tears out, that's going to cause vacuum leaks. So you definitely want to replace your lower intake boot. You might as well go ahead and replace the upper intake boot as well, just so you have brand new rubber, because rubber deteriorates over time. So this is what a rebuilt DISA valve looks like. This is the German Auto Solutions kit. It actually comes with an aluminum flapper, and that's what a DISA valve is supposed to, is supposed to look like and sound like. If you want to test it, hold your finger over this lower port right here, or turn the valve, hold your finger over the lower port, and let it go. If the valve springs halfway open and then opens up when you let go, you know your valve's good. And so the German Auto Solutions kit actually has a long bolt that goes in from this way, so there's no pin to actually fall out on this end. And there's that new O-ring that I was talking about. You can see how much thicker that one is. The next thing we need to talk about is the CCV system. CCV stands for Crankcase Cyclone Ventilation System. It's BMW's term for their PCV system. And a PCV system is on every engine. It means positive crankcase ventilation. And what it does is it takes the blow-by that comes out of the crankcase, usually from out from the valve cover, which is right here. And on a normal car, it will just recycle that directly into the intake. On this system, it actually has an oil separation system. So the blow-by gases actually come out of the valve cover right here, and they enter into here. They go into this little cyclone chamber. The oil gets splattered up on the walls here. The gases get sucked up through here, and they exit out here into the intake manifold to get recycled. The oil drips down here through a return hose that connects down to the bottom of the dipstick tube. Now, the reason this is a problem is because that oil return line right here, it likes to crack. It gets heat aged, the plastic, gets old and brittle, and it just breaks, and that becomes a major, major vacuum leak. The other problem is there is a little rubber diaphragm in here, and if you happen to live in a place that has freezing cold temperatures, the water that's mixed in with the oil inside of this unit will actually freeze and expand, and that ice will sort of puncture the rubber diaphragm in here, and that will cause major problems. It'll cause a lot of oil to get sucked up into your intake, and you'll blow smoke out the back of your exhaust, and you'll get really scared and pull over, and it really sucks. This is a pattern failure on these cars. It has to be changed, probably anywhere from 50,000 to 75,000 miles, so it's definitely something that you're going to want to do if it's never been done. I mean, depending on the climate, you can get away with well over probably 125,000 miles, on these. I bought my car at around 160,000 miles, and it had not been done, but of course it had the failure of the lower hose. So if you have that lower hose failure, what's going to happen is when you go to start your car up, when it's cold in the morning, it's just going to chug. It's going to run really, really poorly. It'll get a little bit better as the engine heats up. But if you have that problem, and if you get P0171 and P0174 codes, the most likely candidate is going to be your CCV system in that lower hose. That's the most likely candidate for that problem. I have other videos that go into detail on those particular codes, so I'll be sure to link those in the description as well. But changing the CCV, it is a little bit of an undertaking. You have to get it to this point. You also then have to take out your oil dipstick tube. You have to unbolt this little electrical distribution box and unplug a couple of the connectors to kind of pull it back. You have to remove the throttle body down here, along with the idle air control valve right up here. And that'll give you enough room to actually get under here and change the oil separator. The oil separator lives underneath the intake right about here, right between number 2 and number 3. And you'll be able to change it like that. There are a lot of videos out there on how to change it with the intake manifold still in the car. I have videos on how to change it by pulling the entire intake manifold out. I recommend doing it that way to the first timer. Number one, because it allows you to change all of the vacuum hoses, which are also dry rotted at this point. And number two, I feel like it gives you a good amount of confidence. If you can follow along with that job, and if you can do that job, you have just taken a step up on your capabilities as far as being able to work on your own car. But it's up to you. I'm certainly not going to judge you for whichever way you go about doing this. The easier way is to just, do it while leaving the intake manifold in there. And I've been meaning to make a video on how to do that because it is quite a lot easier to do it that way. That video will be coming up in the future. Speaking of vacuum hoses, you are going to want to change all of them that you can see. This is a 3/8 inch ID vacuum hose right here. This lower hose, you can see that there's a little bit of section of vacuum hose right here, and it's a hard plastic line from there back. People always ask me about this particular vacuum line, especially when they're removing their intake. They kind of get lost in the whole mess of it, and they end up not knowing where this vacuum line connects to or where it goes to. It actually runs down underneath the car, and it runs into the fuel pressure regulator, which is basically right underneath where the driver's side feet would be on this side of the car. And it doesn't really do anything. It's not really a vacuum line. The fuel pressure regulator is not vacuum modulated. It's only there just in case the fuel pressure regulator, in case the diaphragm inside there bursts and gasoline leaks out. It's there to route the gasoline back into the intake so that it gets recycled and doesn't get exposed to the atmosphere. So don't worry too much about this line. This is where it connects to if you have an M54 engine. That is, if you have a 330 or a 325 or a 320, this is where the line connects to, this little F connector right here. If you have an older M52TU engine, which is going to be your 323s or your 328s, this line is actually going to run up to the back of the fuel rail. There's going to be a little hard line that runs up to the front of the fuel rail, and there's going to be another line coming off of that runs in between the intake manifold right here, and it's going to end up connecting to this little port on the oil separator, and it does the exact same thing. It just routes those gasoline fumes into the oil separator in case the fuel pressure regulator diaphragm bursts. Now there are going to be some other vacuum hoses down underneath here that you can't see that you're basically probably going to need to pull off the intake manifold in order to change. That's why I recommend doing it. Some of them, they all basically run into the back of the intake manifold right here. There are two small ports and there's one big port. The big port is going to be capped off on an M54 engine, and it's going to have an evap line connected to it on an M52 engine. But those two little vacuum lines, one of them runs up back behind the engine and comes around the exhaust side. Let me show you. It's just like over here. We've got sort of a little hard plastic line that runs around the back, and at the end of that line is just a little section of vacuum hose that connects it into the intake manifold. The one back there usually is okay. The one that actually becomes really brittle is the one right in here. Right here is that little section of vacuum line, and the minute you touch that, it's going to crack and break right off because this is a particularly hot area and it just dry rots right away. That vacuum line is going into this little valve, and this valve is part of the secondary air system. This is the secondary air pump. It pumps oxygen into the exhaust manifold right when you start the car when cold, and it helps to heat up the catalytic converter and heat up the oxygen sensors. So that little valve right there is just vacuum actuated. So if this thing cracks, you're going to get lean codes and you're going to get secondary air codes. Those little sections of vacuum tubing are actually 3.5 millimeter internal diameter vacuum hoses, and you can actually get some silicone based ones off of Amazon. I'll throw the link in the description, and these will last a whole lot longer than just your regular rubber vacuum hoses. So these are the best ones to get. Now let's talk about oil leaks. Every one of these engines is going to have an oil leak. It is just a BMW thing, and the reason for that, well, there are three reasons for it, and this is in order of easiest to do, most common to least common and hardest to do. So the easiest to do, the most common, the pattern failure on every engine is going to be your oil filter housing gasket. This is the oil filter, and it's basically in this housing. The housing runs all up and down the whole side of the engine, and it connects to the side of the engine and bolts on with 6 bolts. And there's just a little $3 rubber O-ring kind of gasket that deteriorates and goes bad, and it leaks oil all over everywhere. And you know it's that if your oil leak is coming from the front, you know, this side of the engine towards the front. If you just get underneath the engine and take a look, and if you see oil residue on basically this side of the engine in the front, you know it's the oil filter housing gasket. And trust me, every single one of these needs to be changed. Number 2 is going to be your valve cover gasket. The valve cover gasket is right in here. The whole, you know, it runs along the outside perimeter of the valve cover. There's also one in the center. Every one of those is going to need to be changed. They like to dry rot. They're going to, you know, BMW chose a really bad rubber for it, and it basically will last about 100,000 miles, and it needs to be changed. It's also going to cause some vacuum leaks if you don't change it. The way you know if your valve cover gasket is leaking is it will leak down from this area generally because the whole engine is tilted this way. And it'll leak out all over your exhaust shields right here. See these shiny metal parts? They won't look shiny. It won't look like shiny aluminum on yours if it's if your valve cover gasket's leaking. You can also see evidence where oil dripped onto my exhaust manifold, you know, in the past. And you will see, you can see this bolt right down here. That's the engine mount bolt. That area will be covered in oil. There will be a little pool of oil right there that actually leaks down, and it causes the engine mount on this side to deteriorate, and it makes the rubber all gooey, and it causes that engine mount to rip out. So that's a big telltale sign that your valve cover gasket is leaking. The third and final oil leak on this engine is going to be your oil pan gasket, and that one is going to be somewhat difficult to change. You're going to need a special tool. It's a big engine brace that kind of fits over, and it sits here and here, and it's going to hold up the engine because we're actually going to need to drop the lower subframe down in order to change that gasket. I have a video on it. It's really not that big a deal, and you know, once you do the intake manifold, you're going to have the confidence to be able to do that. It is not as common as the other two. It will need to be done. It is still common. It will need to be done eventually. I don't know exactly when it starts to fail. Definitely after 100,000 miles, but maybe you can get 130 or 140 out of it before it actually starts to leak real bad. Another thing you want to change while you're on this side of the engine, while you're doing the valve cover gasket, is your spark plugs. You're going to have the coils out anyway. Go ahead and just pull your spark plugs out and take a look. If they say BMW on them, that's a surefire sign that they are the OEM plugs, the original ones that this came with. So you want to go ahead and change them in that case. Your plugs should be changed about every 100,000 miles. Another thing you're going to want to do while you have the valve cover off is you're going to want to rebuild your Vanos. The Vanos is BMW's variable valve timing system, and all it does is it advances and retards the cam based on different engine speeds. And there are little pistons inside of them that have O-ring seals, and the O-rings go bad. Of course, basically, are you getting the theme here? All the rubber on this engine goes bad because BMW chose like the worst rubber rather than the best rubber. So you're going to have to actually just, you know, take it apart and just change the O-rings and put it back together. It's actually not that big a deal. I have a video on doing that. It's pretty easy, but you're going to want to do that while you have the valve cover off and you're changing the gasket. So the last thing I want to talk about that's oil related is the high oil consumption that an M54 engine is going to have. There are some misconceptions out there. Some people think that only the 3.0 engines have this problem. That's wrong. All of the M54 engines have it. The 2.0, the 2.5, and the 3.0, they all have this problem because they all have the same upgraded low tension oil control ring, one-piece oil control ring that tends to wear away, and after about 100,000 miles, it starts to cause high oil consumption on the order of 1 quart every 1,000 miles. So the M52TU did not have the problem because it has traditional 3-piece oil control rings. So there are a couple ways you can fix this problem. Number one, you can rebuild your engine and use the M52TU style oil rings, which is what I did. Or you don't have to go that far. You can choose to rip out the old CCV system and you can install an oil catch can. The reason that's going to fix the problem is because as part of the oil catch can system, you're going to run an aftermarket PCV valve, which is going to add a little bit more vacuum into the crankcase. That vacuum tends to suck the oil control ring to the piston wall, and it cures the oil consumption problem. I don't particularly like oil catch cans. I just think there's some problems related to them, and kind of cumbersome to install and all that stuff. And it's just, I don't know. I'm not a fan of it. If you are, that's fine. They're somewhat useful in really cold climates where you tend to have freezing temperatures. So the other way to fix this problem is you can actually do what we call the O2 pilot mod, which is where you leave your stock CCV system and you just run a vacuum line from the back of the intake manifold and you run it into this port on the oil separator. And that will add the increased vacuum into the crankcase and solve the problem. We call that the O2 pilot mod after the guy who came up with it. And that is the mod that I recommend because it's just the easiest to do. It takes 5 minutes to do and just, easy. So those are all the common pattern failures on the M52TU and M54 engines that came with these cars. It's not that much, right? Pretty easy. You got this. So there are a couple of other suspension-related problems that you might encounter with an E46. Just like all cars, after about 100,000 miles, the shocks and struts are going to go bad. You got struts up front and shocks in the back. The way you test that is you push down the car, and if it's good, this is what it's going to look like. One bounce, and then it stops. So normally when shocks are bad, you could actually push down, and you'll see that the car kind of springs a little bit more. What I'm finding, though, surprisingly, is that they kind of look the same. This test ends up being the same whether it's good or bad. I'll tell you, the shocks on this one definitely are bad. You can just tell when you're driving around. You can particularly tell when you hit bumps, your head's going to hit the roof rather than the whole car absorbing the impact properly. But this one is a little easier to push down on. I can kind of get it going like that, and it doesn't really fight me because the thing's kind of wavy. You kind of have to get it going because, again, the springs are a little stiffer on a BMW. But that's one test that might be able to tell you if you have bad shocks. I do have another test that involves disconnecting the shock from the rear suspension components, and I'll link that video down in the description. That's a definitive way to tell if your shocks are bad. And if the shocks are bad, the struts in the front are probably bad as well. Another component that goes bad are the front control arm bushings, which are actually in the back of the front control arm. And the way you can tell if they're bad is, number one, you can try pushing on the tire with your foot, like right around here. You can just try rocking the tire towards the back of the car. And if it looks like this, it's fine. These ones have actually been replaced. But if the tire rolls back and forth quite a ways, if there's a whole lot of movement like that, you definitely know your front control arm bushings are bad. Also, another way to know is when you're backing up, if you change from forward to reverse, or when you hit the brake, you'll feel the suspension shift and you'll hear the knocking. So that's another way to tell. The other way to check and see if your front control arm bushings are okay or not is to jack up your car, put it on jack stands, and get underneath it and take a look. So this is the front of the car and that's the back. Right there, you can see the control arm bushing. This is the driver's side, the left side of the car. And all you have to do is just move the tire, and if that bushing is gone, this whole control arm is going to pivot this way, right? And it'll pivot back and forth. That's what you were doing when you were stepping on or you were trying to push on the tire, is you're just literally moving this control arm, articulating it about this ball joint, and it would move side to side. You would clearly see that it's deteriorated. But as you see, I've recently replaced mine, so they're good. Another thing you want to take a look at are your tie rods. This is what connects your steering rack to your wheel carrier right here. That's what allows the wheel to steer. And basically the ball joints in these can go out over time. Yours are probably going to be a little loose. You see right now I cannot move mine at all, but these loosen up over time, and after about 70,000 miles, they'll start to rotate back and forth like this about the ball joint, which is not necessarily bad. It's only bad if you go to move your wheel and you actually see play between the steering knuckle right here and the ball joint itself. So the ball joint's in here. You'll start to see that move in and out if you go ahead and try to move the tire in and out this way. So another commonly wearing component is the steering bushing, which is going to be this bushing right here. This little rubber disc, as you can see. That actually will get play in between the links on it. And the way you test that is you just try to move your wheel back and forth while you're staring up at it, and if there's play, you're going to see it. You're going to see it rocking. like this, back and forth. That's easy to change. I've got a DIY video on that. By the way, if you want to drain and replace your power steering fluid, this is that hose that you need to disconnect. It's going to come with a factory clamp that you just pry off with a screwdriver, and then you replace it with a worm style clamp, as you see I have done. While you have the car jacked up, you want to go ahead and check the rear trailing arm bushings. And this is the driver's side tire here, so this is the left side tire. That's the front of the car. That's the back of the car. So we're looking at the driver's side one here. The way you tell on this one is you just go ahead and get a pry bar up in here like that. Now if you see tension like that, if it's springy like that, you're good. If the thing just kind of knocks to one side of this housing in here back and forth, the bushing's gone and you're going to need to replace it. Another problem you may or may not have is with the outside temperature sensor, which is right here. This is actually a little splash housing, splash shield right here. This thing, it gets torn away. It happens on a lot of E46s. I mean, especially used ones. You go over curves, you know, you hit something, this thing rips out, it goes flying, it rips out the outside temperature sensor, and that's actually going to cause problems with your air conditioning system. So what you need to do is you need to find not only the sensor, but the connector as well. And sometimes some other harnesses can get ripped out in the process. The way you know which wires are the correct ones is the wire colors. They're going to be purple with blue and black stripes, I believe. Another problem with the air conditioning system is going to be with the final blower motor resistor. It's called the final stage resistor. It actually lives up underneath. You can get at it from behind. If you have to take out the glove compartment here and the actual access panel down here, the plastic panel down there, and it just lives up behind in there, and it's not bolted in or anything. You just have to reach up and kind of pull it out. You might have to move some things out of the way, but it's a little difficult just because of the area it's in. But it's, you know, once you kind of realize where it is and what it is, you can get it out and pop a new one in. But you have to change that part. Most of the OEM parts, they go bad. And there's a new part design. It's a weird looking part. It's got all these metal fingers sticking out of it, and the old ones have fat metal fingers, the new ones have skinnier metal fingers. Another common problem with every E46 is going to be these A, B, and C pillars, the trim on them. The fabric just comes off, and you're just going to need to actually pull the housings off and just recover them with some fabric. I have not done that DIY yet. I've been putting it off for many years. The previous owner actually recovered my C pillars as well as the A pillars, so I don't have to do those. I just have to do the B pillars. Another common problem on these is the sunroofs. You see how this is actually hard to go back this last way? The sunroofs actually come off. There are these little clips that the sunroof panel fits into, and they need to be lubricated. They can also come off, and then the whole thing will just kind of be flapping all over the place. So I don't have any DIYs on that yet, but those will be coming up. Of course, another thing you're going to need are window regulators. It's pretty much guaranteed on this car, and just almost every used car. You know, there's no used car where it doesn't happen, but almost every window regulator is going to need to be replaced in this car at some point. They probably last about 125,000 miles, something like that. So I think we're going to have to end the video here. I could go on and on, but we're starting to get into sort of the non-common problems, and I really wanted to keep this to just problems that almost every E46 is going to have. So these are all the things that you're going to need to do once you buy an E46. You never know. A lot of these may have been done already. You're just going to have to check it out and see. It's really not that difficult at the end of the day. I've got videos on all this stuff. Everything will be linked down in the description, so check all that out. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. It really helps me out. Subscribe if you want to see more. I'm the 50s Kid. Thanks a lot for watching.